Ladies and gents, welcome to the KPPC, the Kuwait Public Policy Center, our flagship program, the lecture series. Tonight we have a very special guest, Dr. Tom Fleming, and the subject matter that we will be tackling tonight is the creative economy, opportunities and challenges in a time of crisis. So a quick background about the lecture. The lecture will introduce core concepts regarding the global creative economy, introducing emerging trends, and consider how the creative industries and the culture can play a vital role in economic and social recovery. Dr. Tom will set out some major opportunities for Kuwait and the region to be a hub and a catalyst for the creative economy. This includes approaches to talent development, clusters and hubs, innovation and soft power. The lecture will draw on examples from across the world where TFCC has been playing a leading role in evidence, strategy, and policy development for the creative economy. So a quick background about our speaker tonight, Dr. Tom. He's a global authority on the creative economy. He's the director of Tom Fleming Creative Consultancy, a leading research, strategy, and policy agency for culture and the creative economy. TFCC is based in London and Porto, with associates in every region across the world. His work has ranged from national creative economy and cultural strategies to targeted work with cities and institutions. Over 20 years, he has developed projects in over 60 countries and 200 cities. Clients include UNESCO, World Bank, European Commission, USAID, British Council, and multiple governments, municipalities, and institutions. TFCC has been active in the Middle East and Gulf states for over a decade, with projects in Kuwait, UAE, Egypt, and Lebanon. It's an honor to host Dr. Tom tonight, and the floor is yours, Dr. Tom, please.
Well, thank you very much for that warm introduction. It's a real pleasure to participate in this lecture series. My only regret is, of course, that I'm not there with you and we're not meeting face to face. It's almost a year to the day when I was last in Kuwait, and it's pretty much one of the last places I went to before the world changed. So it's with a level of regret, but also a huge amount of fondness for the country that I am undertaking this lecture with you this evening. I'm just going to share my screen, so bear with me 1 second. Hopefully this will work reasonably seamlessly. My colleagues will tell me if this is not visible. Hopefully it is. As you heard in the introduction, really, this is about providing an overarching view on the role that the creative economy might have as we hopefully emerge from this health crisis, but also as we try to reframe the strategic approach that we have toward a better economy, a more inclusive economy, a more diverse and hopefully more sustainable economy in a post-COVID landscape. And I'm going to reflect a little bit on what's changed and also to explore perhaps what the main questions might be if we are to develop a strategic approach to the creative economy in a time of crisis in a country like Kuwait. So let me just try to make the slides move. Here we go. Yes, so you've had an introduction to me already, so I don't need to dwell on this whatsoever. I suppose the only point to say here is that we are actively trying to build knowledge in a collaborative way. So although I run a research consultancy organization, we're nothing without the knowledge, the ideas, the content, and the challenge really that comes from partners working across the cultural and creative sector and more broadly in civil society and the economy. So I would welcome feedback and ideas and further dialogue as an outcome of this lecture, because it's only through collaborative practice and endeavor that we can develop something that is better than we have today in terms of the approach to culture and the creative economy. So I'm going to draw from a portfolio of projects that we've led on all over the world, and I'm going to reflect on their application in a Kuwaiti context, and then hopefully that will stimulate debate, discussion, and future dialogue for how to develop a strategic approach to the creative economy in this wonderful nation of Kuwait. I don't come into this blind. As I said, I was in Kuwait this time last year, and this has been part of a really enjoyable collaborative process with the British Council and the National Council for Culture, Arts and Literature, NCCAL, in Kuwait, where we've been working with them to develop a creative economy vision and framework. We've met many people through a process of sector engagement, of mapping, of dialogue, of prioritization. We've been working to build awareness of the creative economy as a strategic driver for Kuwait. And we've been trying to develop some comparative analysis so you can benchmark yourselves in relation to other places. And the goal ultimately is to have a much more systematic, ambitious, strategic approach to the creative economy of Kuwait, so that Kuwait can build from its strengths, from its long history and its current dynamism to become a major global hub for the creative economy. So why, I guess, is a big question that everybody continues to ask us wherever we go about the creative economy, and why would we want to develop it in a Kuwaiti context? On the one hand, this is about diversification of the economy, a more sustainable economy overall, potentially in a post-oil or a hybrid economic reality. It's about driving innovation across the economy, the application of creativity. It's about nurturing the full talent base and supporting people to develop enterprises through their creativity, through the intellectual property and the power of their imagination, which, as I'll go on to describe, is such a key part of the global economy today. It's about utilizing in a productive and an imaginative way the heritage assets of the country, the tangible in terms of the built environment, the literature, the music, the film, but also the intangible in terms of memories, the sense of identity, the sense of place. And it's about soft power. It's about telling stories that can more productively provide a profile for Kuwait as a place for creativity, as a place for imagination, for collaboration, for openness, for dialogue, and for innovation. So these are the kinds of things I'm going to be covering in this lecture in terms of why this matters. Another way of putting it is that there's a functional triple bottom line in investing in and supporting the creative economy. It's about the economy, yes. It's about jobs, and I'll talk about why it's a high growth sector, why it can provide a lot of jobs and can be quite inclusive as well. But it's also around driving innovation and competitiveness across the economy. Creative businesses deliver services, ideas, products across the economy. And it's a contributor to local distinctiveness and placemaking, because it comes from you, it comes from your culture and identity, or the combination of culture and identities in a certain place, actively remade through production. And that's important in terms of having a fresh narrative in a global context, where you're all competing as nations to retain talent, to attract talent, to attract investment, to develop an economy overall. And now this would be the normal sort of pattern introduction that I was doing until this time last year. But obviously now everything is different. We've had to reframe the narrative about why the creative economy matters. And COVID has been an enormous disruptor, and it's also been an enormous accelerator in the way certain aspects of our society have shifted. It's obviously a disruptor in terms of mobility, in terms of the health crisis, in terms of the impact that's having on confidence, on productivity, on civil society. But it's also weirdly an accelerator of things that were happening already, in terms of, for example, the take-up of digital content, which has become much more mainstream, whether it be through Netflix subscriptions, or whether it be through the way people are communicating with one another as we are today. So there's been a kind of hyper speed impact in terms of certain technologies. But we don't know how this will land, because that's been in an unusual year where we haven't had the physical coexisting with the digital. And obviously that hybrid reality is something that we'll be exploring in the future as things hopefully settle down and as we start to move around more in person. But certainly COVID has changed the goalposts and the terms of reference. And that has implication for all kinds of policy and all kinds of practice. The mayor of Milan, Giuseppe Sala, talked of the need to rethink the rhythms of the city. That affects approaches to planning, transport, mobility, healthcare provision, education, and obviously economic development. And we need to do that for the creative economy as well. The author and futurist Alvin Toffler talked about the need to unlearn and relearn as an active process, whether we have crisis or not. It's the agility, the adaptiveness, and the ability to unlock the imagination that is critical to be able to survive in the present, let alone thrive in the future. And we need to do this on our own terms. There is no singular pathway for development around the creative economy. It's about local development pathways, as the United Nations articulated almost a decade ago in their most important creative economy report. So that means understanding your assets, your qualities, your instincts, and developing something on those terms. And it's about exploring how, at a local level, within Kuwait and other contexts, you can nurture interactions, build the dynamism, generate the cluster impact, to be able to drive growth and innovation in the creative economy. There are some basics that we need to hold on to. And in fact, the crisis is perhaps helping us to relearn what we value the most. So particularly in the most acute times of lockdown, people have yearned for physical interaction. They've missed culture in its broadest sense as a part of their lives. And they perhaps felt, at least initially, that they've struggled to come up for the air you need for creativity to really prosper. And these are the core elements of a creative economy. And so people have felt stifled, really, but they've also had a yearning, a hunger to be creative, to relearn and explore their imagination. And that's because the creative economy, or sorry, the creativity, I should say, and its future articulation in the creative economy is an essential human survival skill or condition. From our ancestors who were finding ways to innovate, to use different tools to survive in their natural landscape, through to the way we build our cities today, the way we use different technologies to reframe the context in which we are living. These are aspects of our creative imagination, our intuition, and our innovation. And these are core elements for our creative economy, which links to how we nurture the skill sets, the talent base, the civil society, where creativity is a skill that we retain and a muscle that we strengthen. And creativity is as important as literacy. I would argue not just for the creative industries, which I'll describe in a minute, but for survival in a world of unknowns, particularly when the jobs of tomorrow don't even exist today. So creativity, I would actually go beyond what Sir Ken Robinson says here and suggest that it's not as important as literacy. It is a type of literacy in itself. And this is a really important foundation stone for a creative economy, because we need to ensure that young people, and as people travel through their education system into their careers, they have the flexibility to adapt, to change, to problem solve, to collaborate, to cross boundaries, to be creative overall. And that's where the business of creativity comes from. That's where the economy of creativity comes from. Because if you haven't got a population that has that literacy, then it's very hard to develop and grow a creative economy. So these are root and branch agendas. So when we see a top-down approach to creativity or to culture, to building soft power through cultural infrastructure, which is a huge economic development driver internationally. Obviously in the Middle East and the Gulf states, it's a big agenda as well. But that needs to be coupled with the softer infrastructure of talent development, of nurturing a creative workforce overall. And that's vital for having that diverse creative economy in the future. So what is it that ultimately I mean by the creative industries or the creative economy? And this is something that we often find as a blocker to effective strategy and policy in different contexts, because people can't agree what it is that we're talking about or what sits within the definition of the creative industries. And I would argue that although it's important to have reference points at a global level, such as the definition provided here by UNESCO, it's also important to self-define, at least to self-define the value chain or the ecosystem of the creative industries in your own country. So UNESCO talk about sectors which for whose principal purpose is the production, reproduction, promotion or distribution of goods and services which are cultural, artistic or heritage related. It's about artistic expression, it's about creative content. In the UK, back in 1998, the country undertook the first ever mapping study for the creative industries. And back then, they identified 13 sectors as being the mainstays of the creative industries. This is subsequently moved to a smaller number of 8, recognizing that sectors change and increasingly they are convergent. So, for example, if you're putting on a TV show, you're also investing in music, in fashion, in design, in crafts, in digital publishing, in writing, in a whole range of other things. So we are seeing increasingly a horizontally integrated creative industry sector rather than a vertically driven set of interdependent or independent sectors. But these are the kinds of areas that we're talking about. But there is a more holistic opportunity here, hence why I talk about the creative economy rather than the creative industries, in that a creative economy is a more systemic approach. It's about the application of creativity and the provision of services and products which come from the creative industries into the wider economy to deliver other outcomes. So if we take digital technology in the rapid, accelerated progression of digital hardware and software over the last few years, they have at their heart this convergence of tech and creative content design. They convene these different areas. And therefore you can see the way that the creative industries drives competitiveness and growth across the wider economy. And of course, by having this hardware, which is designed, conceptualized, a creative industries product, you need the content, the stories, the things that you use the hardware for. And that also comes from the creative industries. And you need the talent, as I mentioned before, and the creative industries is driven by proportionately or disproportionately large numbers of small businesses working to explore their creative potential, to develop and sell their creative intellectual property, whether that be through services or products. And so much of the strategic approach to the creative economy is about building the conditions where creative talent can flourish in a specific context. But not to forget culture, and I mentioned this before, is that the creative industries comes from a cultural context. And there are strong relationships between the arts and heritage and your contemporary creative economy. You can look at this in a diagrammatic way, where you can see how, in this diagram, there are core creative fields, there are artists, there are poets, there are photographers, there are people who are expressing themselves very instinctively. But then when you start to look at how they present, how they perform, how they sell, how they distribute, how they influence, you can see there are relationships across these concentric circles towards the wider economy through supply chains or value chains. And this is a critical element of any sector. I think that the creative industries, given its diversity and its ability to cross boundaries into other sectors, is something that can be really impactful for a whole economy, for a wider strategic agenda. And we've undertaken a lot of research around this in terms of understanding not just the core value of the creative industries, but the wider spillover effects across the whole economy. And this also, I guess, therefore links into discussions about innovation, how you nurture imagination, how you build collaborative practice, and how you become a place that doesn't just respond to innovative change generated by somewhere else, but you become a crucible of innovation yourselves. You drive innovation yourselves. And this is why the creative industries are being seen as so important, as complementary to other parts of the economy in different contexts. So that's a bit of background, and I'm going to give you a bit more background in terms of some overarching themes in a minute. But just to pause for a second and just to reflect on that in the context of Kuwait. And Kuwait, as a country with its extraordinary history, its well-educated workforce, its dynamic sense of identity, has a really strong opportunity to develop a distinctive approach to the creative economy. To do that requires a systems-based approach in terms of strategy and policy and partnership, but it also requires an approach that embraces the potential of the talent force and validates the idea of a creative job, a creative enterprise as a key area of the economy going forward. And these two things need to come together as a whole. So I've got 10 quick observations just to throw your way that I think are important on a global level, and I'll think about their application in the Kuwaiti context. And then I'll come to the end of my presentation, which will just reflect on what we've learned in the Kuwaiti context and use that to generate some observations or questions about where Kuwait might go from here. So the first thing to recognize this is that notwithstanding the current crisis, the creative economy is a story of enormous economic growth. It's a global success story of the last generation. And it's a growth story that is universal in terms of every region is experiencing significant growth in the creative industries. And the highest and the fastest growth in recent years has been south of or close to the equator. So a lot of growth, and the largest markets historically were in the north, in the global north, but that is starting to shift. It's starting to shift as the demographics change, as digital becomes pervasive, and as the middle classes grow in the global south. So it's a story of growth, and the United Nations talks about this with enormous zeal. And obviously now they're talking about how the sector can recover and drive growth as we move from this crisis that we're in at the moment. We've seen paradigm shift in terms of the percentage of global GDP that the creative industries generates and contributes towards, and it could be as high as 12% of the overall GDP of the world, which is not a small amount. And if we look at certain countries, the creative industries has an even stronger proportionate role to play. The UK, which has had quite a systematic approach to policy and investment over the last 20 years, and also, which is very important, a systematic approach to measuring the sector, talks up the value of the creative industries as generating over £100 billion a year. That's been punctured somewhat, I'm sure, in the last year, although certain parts of the creative industries have continued to grow, such as high-end TV, for which we have this huge surge in hunger for content. So other countries internationally, including Kuwait, I hope, are looking for their market share, their piece of the pie, on broadly a growth narrative. We've seen programs in Thailand, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, in South Korea, which have followed development programs in Europe, particularly within the European Union. We've seen lots of municipalities focusing on how they can become a more creative city, building the critical mass, articulating a new narrative for their soft power, and trying to become more competitive in terms of talent attraction and inward investment, and even cultural tourism. We've seen places trying to develop spikes of activity through cluster strategies in the creative industries. And we've seen increasingly countries closer to you in Kuwait look at how the creative industries can become part of a wider development program, particularly a more nuanced approach around inclusive growth and heritage reimagination or revitalization and regeneration of urban areas. So just as we've seen in downtown Cairo, there's also interesting potential in Kuwait City for building dynamic hubs of creative practice in relatively heritage environments. So when we look in the Gulf region, each country is taking a different approach towards embracing the creative industries. Clearly, Saudi Arabia in recent years has really opened up a much more strategic development arc around cultural infrastructure, but also around creative industries. Obviously also thinking post-oil, but also economic diversification and soft power. And then we come all the way around and we come to the UAE, which obviously is trying to position itself as a global hub for transactions exchange in the creative economy, but also as a place for content creation, particularly around digital content creation. And it's positioning things like the visual arts and design as value adders to some of its bigger goals around tourism and inward investment. So when we see articles such as this one about Dubai being the most vibrant creative sector in the region, I hope that that provokes a little bit of pushback in Kuwait, where you might think, well, actually, we have the potential to be equally, if not more so, vibrant, but in a different way, on our own terms, with our own flavor, with our own qualities. Just as when we see Saudi taking a leap of faith around the creative economy, can Kuwait do so again, but on its own terms, building from its unique strengths? These are the kinds of questions we've been exploring. And just as we see up along the coast, Abu Dhabi, now starting to think about the software, the creative talent, the enterprises, after spending so long thinking about the hardware, buildings like the Louvre, how can we ensure that we don't, excuse me, how we don't in Kuwait fall away or fall to this, fall off the pace when
Tom, we're losing you. I think your internet is weak. Tom? So apologies for that. We're just going to wait a few more seconds until Tom logs in again. I think we have some technical issues. Once again, apologies for that. Okay, so Tom is back. Sorry about that.
Okay, sorry about that. This is the one second, everybody. This is the reality we're living in these days, unfortunately. I will share my screen. Can you see my screen now? Colleagues?
Just give it a sec. Not yet.
Okay. Could you give me the option, sorry, colleagues, to share the screen?
Hosting, please.
Yep, yeah.
Give it a sec. Can you just run through the last slide before you got cut off?
I can't see the option to share the screen. 1 second. Apologies.
Okay, now it's working.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, so
slideshow. Yeah.
So I think I left you here. Okay, so I was talking about the importance of building from your distinctive past and your distinctive creative and artistic qualities, your literature, your architecture, your deep set cultural traditions, and how they provide a vernacular, a sense of identity, which can be reimagined in a contemporary creative economy. And my point was that this is where the authenticity comes from in other cultural forms, products across the world, whether that be in flamenco dance or in French or Nordic cinema or in Danish design. These are things that have a travel story within them. They feel authentic to the culture from which they came. They're both contemporary, but also deeply rooted. And the built environment plays an important role there as well. The validity of creative expression is often amplified in somewhere with an ambience and a sense of history, which is rooted in the past. Great ideas often come in old buildings, and this is something that we mustn't forget in a Kuwaiti context. And there are also recent examples of real creative flourishing in Kuwait, such as through the film sector or in architecture and contemporary and modernist architecture, which provide new trajectories in terms of heritage and creative contemporary practice coming together. And so there is a proven track record in Kuwait to explore that link between heritage, modernity, and the future. And that can be something that is manifestly about the old, such as on somewhere like Falaka Island, or it could be the more recent old, such as the 1970s architecture and the way that the city has a distinctive canvas in which to play and create new types of content, new types of creative economy activity. So these links mustn't be forgotten or underappreciated. The third observation around the global creative economy, and this is something that I think is really key in Kuwait, is the way that it's become increasingly fragmented on the one hand, and as I'll say in a minute, consolidated on the other hand. As I said earlier on, the creative industries is disproportionately made up of many, many small businesses, often working on a portfolio existence. 95% of the creative industries are SMEs. A big proportion are working as sole traders, as freelancers. And the COVID crisis has really put into sharp relief the challenges that those micro enterprises face. They've become the most vulnerable. They've been impacted on the most significantly by this crisis because they couldn't work. And a lot of state interventions haven't reached them. But even in normal times, the creative industries lacks a united voice. It lacks a consolidated approach to networking. It lacks visibility, even though there's many people working in the sector, because it's not big business in many instances. It's hard to invest in, reach out to that talent base. There's issues around confidence. There's issues around IP infringement or IP literacy. And there's a challenge for micro enterprises to continue to reskill and to build their businesses unless they're supported to collaborate and to connect and gain scale through those collaborations. So this is where, in the Kuwait context, you're still in the foothills of developing those kinds of interventions that convene connectivity across the creative industries in terms of clusters, in terms of networks. But there are green shoots, there are things happening, such as through the convening role of organizations like and hubs like Nukat, through the through the storytelling and the amplification of creative talent that we have through Khalij-esque and that kind of platform, and obviously that works on a regional level as well. We're starting to see a growing visibility, validation of the creative industries, and people are recognizing that they could potentially work in creative enterprise as a career choice, and one which wouldn't mean they're isolated and disconnected overall. So we're in a process, I think, in Kuwait of ecosystem building in the creative industries. But there's a long, long way to go to build to a scale, level of consolidation that will enable Kuwait to genuinely have that diverse economy and have a real cluster of creative value-adding entrepreneurs. And I said that although that we have this enormous fragmentation across the creative industries of many, many micro enterprises, increasingly fragile through this crisis, on a global level, there is also this growth of consolidation. And this is happening, in some ways it's been accelerated by the COVID crisis, as we've seen the majors, the content aggregators and commissioners grow their market share. And they obviously look to hoover up micro enterprises and to internalize that content creation within their own portfolio. And there are issues there about power, there are issues around monopoly, and there are issues around labor rights, all sorts of things. But broadly, though, that has accelerated things like the take-up of hardware, which could provide opportunities for micro enterprises working in the creative industries, because they've invested in hardware often as a core part of their business models. But there are other kinds of consolidation, the consolidation of major urban centers and regions in the creative industries. And there are a handful of absolutely global creative cities, New York, London, Tokyo, Paris. To an extent, you could say that there's a growing kind of macro globally significant cluster across the Gulf states, but there's still a lot missing, which needs to be developed to have that genuine competitive edge. And then there's a consolidation around key institutions, universities, business schools that are specializing in the creative industries, are starting to really lead the development process in that context. We need to think about the urban role of cities and how Kuwait as an urban society can become a real hub on a global level. And we need to think about how you link into other urban centres. So if we look at the next generation of population growth and urbanisation, you're on a similar latitude to major African cities and Indian subcontinent cities and Southeast Asian cities that are hugely growing. So the opportunity to be a hub, a platform for the global creative economy in the global south is hugely powerful. And there you are, right in the middle of that growth profile. And you also have aggregators in Kuwait who are playing a strategic development role and a leadership role already, and a very active role in our work in trying to connect and aggregate the creative economy in the country and at a regional level. So companies like Zain are really important players in that landscape. We do need to look at, as I mentioned, the issues around power and how the business models are really squeezing out opportunities for micro creatives to flourish. Music being the most challenging sector these days, where it's very hard to make a living in the contemporary music sector purely through downloads off those major aggregator platforms like Spotify. You have to go out there and tour, you have to be able to sell merchandise, you have to find other ways to supplement your income. And there are real questions as to whether the music sector, as we currently understand it, can continue where so much talent can't afford to participate in the music industry. So there's some structural challenges we need to look at overall. Fifth, and this is, I've touched on this already in many ways, this is in a process of absolute transformation. The dizzying depthlessness of digital development across the global creative economy, content-hungry channels and platforms, huge disruptions of business models, new clusters emerging all of the time. So you have to sprint to stand still in the global creative economy. In that context, the digital infrastructure offer is absolutely key. So the extent to which places that become 5G pioneers can steal a march on places in terms of being clusters for artificial intelligence, for virtual reality, for augmented reality, for new immersive approaches to the creative industries. This is going to be really key, connecting your hardware and your bandwidth to the creative talent pool, and doing so in an equitable way as well. And this raises questions around knowledge, around innovation, around infrastructure, and how the university sector, for example, can become a test bed for the collision of creative content with emergent technologies. To what extent can you in Kuwait be a lab that explores how these boundaries can be crossed? So you generate the new business models and the new content related to the new technology. We've been working recently in a very old economy environment in Coventry in England, which is a place where which is well known for its automobile industry. And they're looking at the future of driverless cars. They're looking at the future of infotainment inside driverless cars, and what's that going to do to the way that audiences or consumers behave in relation to cultural consumption. So there are so many different questions at play when we look at technological transformation. And there are also challenges though around power, and you'll all be, I'm sure, familiar with discussions around how we're living in the age of the algorithm, and how business models and distribution and marketing is channeled in terms of data rather than something more cultural, more personalized in that context. So, and we are, and that is true, and that's that's something that's going to affect our lives even more in the future, whether it's in terms of how we move through our cities, the extent to which our personal data is used by authorities or by the private sector or by both. But we also have this strange kind of counter narrative now, which I've called here prosumption. It's really around how audiences or consumers are increasingly proactively building relationships with the producers, with the creators, to co-create meaning and to co-create experiences in the landscape. So we're moving from what I would call supply chains to value webs, an interactive, more values-driven approach to consumption. And you can see that particularly in relation to the Generation Z or even the millennials in terms of the acquisition of products. There's a movement much more towards sharing and renting rather than just owning. That's partly because of the high density housing that a lot of younger generations are living in. It's also because they value things differently And it's not about stuff, it's about stories, it's about content, and it's about collaborative or community experiences. So there is this kind of weird counterpoint between the atomization of data-driven algorithmic approaches to the provision of services, products, etc., in the creative and wider knowledge economy, and our search for the authentic, for the personal, for the communal. These things are happening at the same time. So we need to foreground talent. We need our creatives, as I said before, to develop and grow and feel validated. And these are creatives that are working in a fragile environment, as I've already said. And they're creatives that are nimbly moving across boundaries, the arts, creative technologies, social enterprise. They often don't inhabit one space for very long, and they normally co-inhabit lots of spaces all of the time. And we have, as I said before, a crisis in the education sector where creativity is often something that's designed out rather than developed within us. And the older we get, the less creative we often become because of the way we've been educated. And that's creating a challenge. For example, how can we develop those skill sets so people can operate across the portfolio existence, which is the reality for most jobs in most sectors these days? And how can we ensure that a creative individual has the kinds of skill sets so they can thrive in a transforming creative economy? Access to markets, access to IP support, access to peer knowledge and a community, targeted business support and planning, and a kind of validation that they can grow their business in a specific context. And this is where we bring this down to place. It is in specific places where you have layers of history, where you have co-location, where you have an ecosystem. It's in a place-based unit that creative talent recognizes its role and recognizes its opportunity. People often move to cities now, or to an extent to countries, based on not just the job, but also on the sense that there's an opportunity for a good quality of life, for there's going to be a dynamic culture, and also there's going to be opportunities to get the next job or the one after that. And this comes down to cultural planning or creative placemaking. And this is the intersection I've been talking about before, the intersection of heritage and creativity, something that blends the past and towards enabling a better future. This is all about an ecosystem approach with a civil society around culture and creativity. And there's really interesting movements in Kuwait now where these emergent hubs are starting to build an ecosystem, starting to build a creative talent pool. And people are coming back, or people aren't leaving because they recognize there's an opportunity to be part of something bigger and better, to work, but also to play in a Kuwaiti environment. And this is where creative hubs and spaces can be vital enablers here, both physical spaces, but also networks, spaces for creation, artist studios, design hubs, collaboration platforms, R&D labs. And these are all different examples. This is an example in Kuala Lumpur in an old printing press to become a contemporary creative hub, using an old piece of physical heritage in an old economy model to create a new creative industries cluster. This is Telliskivi on the left in Estonia, in an old industrial district, which has now become a creative village. Or in Lisbon, you have these imaginative use of shipping containers to create this architecturally striking creative district. Or in Bristol, a pervasive media studio which connects scientists, artists, technologists, social scientists. There's even an astronomer in this open space workshop environment where people are invested in to collaborate, to develop new socially driven technologies which are underpinned by creativity. And in Kuwait, you have spaces like NEU, which is bringing together different kinds of creative. And potentially, it's germinating new types of creative activity in the creative economy. But we need to be mindful that as we build the creative ecosystem, the creative community, that we do so in a way that's inclusive, that isn't just for rich kids, that isn't just for certain genders, that isn't just about young people, but it can be intergenerational. Because the creative industries is a sector with a litany of wasted talent, too many missed opportunities, too many people have tried and tried, and they've not been able to try anymore. And people who have less access to social capital, less access to financial capital, will often struggle to be able to participate in the creative economy, whatever their talent base, and that is a tragedy. So we need to think about who participates. And also going back to my point about heritage and distinctiveness, this is not just about replicating some, a hipster creative landscape you might see in London or New York or Berlin, etc. This is about a distinctive, authentic creative landscape that you can only develop in a Kuwaiti environment. And then finally, this question around impact and sustainability as well. The Sustainable Development Goals of the UN have become increasingly important as a way of framing the strategic approach to the creative industries. Because the creative industries can be a progressive force for good in terms of building awareness around environmental sustainability, in supporting inclusive growth, and obviously they can be drivers around carbon neutral technologies. They can help towards designing and facilitating smart cities. So there's a progressive sustainable development opportunity as well in Kuwait and elsewhere. And as we think about COVID again and coming out of the COVID crisis, so many people have been thinking very deeply about, do they want to travel so much? What do they value? How do you have access to nature whilst also enjoying living in a city? And obviously the use of digital is opening up new questions around how we collaborate, work together on a global level. I don't know the answers to how this will play out, but I know that we're going to have a more sustainably driven strategic approach to the creative economy as a direct outcome of this crisis. And things that seemed frivolous in the past, such as Dan Roosegaard's smog vacuum, which he piloted in China and then brought back to the Netherlands, which sucks smog out of the atmosphere. And then he utilizes that smog to create jewelry as a kind of gimmick, but it's also a kind of an artistic and creative endeavor. This kind of thing, actually, I think will be increasingly mainstreamed because it enhances the public space. It sends messages around sustainability, and it embraces the creative imagination of creative talent. So in the creative economy of Kuwait, just to finish, as I mentioned, we're undertaking a range of activities in the country which I hope are going to change the strategic approach to the creative economy. There are some real strengths. I've touched on these already in many ways: a strong grassroots, some significant clusters in things like TV, in music, some great facilities, historic, long-held qualities in terms of your creative and cultural landscape. There is a growing awareness of the creative industries. There are, I guess, broad sector-neutral investment opportunities and funding across the knowledge economy and the tech sector. You've got some emergent clusters and networks. You've obviously got a well-educated and sophisticated domestic market, and you're in a regional market, which also offers similar conditions. Strong tech sector. And there's some really, really distinctive and high and really sharp strategic tools that you have to play with here. But you have some challenges. You have some weaknesses. I mentioned the creative education issue. I think there's a cultural challenge around valuing the creative industries or creative occupations. There are challenges around censorship, as there are everywhere, and they could play out differently in every context. There are challenges around the support system. There are challenges, I think, on a strategic leadership level. How do we build a movement that champions the creative economy? And there are some specific sort of things around, for example, legal frameworks for IP in the creative industries, or around targeted sector support programs, such as around film. Lots of countries have film commissions trying to build their film infrastructure. So there are certain things that are more challenging in the Kuwaiti environment. But for us overall, the message is one that is eminently positive and one of opportunity, because spending more time in Kuwait and with Kuwaiti people, there's a real appreciation of aesthetics. There's a real appreciation of the power of people to change and make a difference in a specific context. And you obviously see that in a country with a deep history that has built so fast in recent generations that people can really change the trajectory of development for good. And so we recommend, and we think there's an opportunity for Kuwait to become a strategic leader at a regional and a global level, to become much more of a hub and a cluster, and to do so through a holistic strategic approach with creativity. This is the challenge overall, the challenge that we are putting back to colleagues in Kuwait. And the ultimate challenge is about working across the boundaries that historically countries don't like crossing, between different sectors, different ministries, different departments, different organizations. But if we do cross the boundaries in Kuwait, there is the potential to establish the country as a genuine creative powerhouse at a regional level. There's an opportunity for talent to prosper, an opportunity to build world-leading infrastructure and support and investment and networks in the creative industries. There's an opportunity to tell a Creative Kuwait story with a brand that isn't just about marketing, it's underpinned by authenticity and real content, so that Kuwait can become a global meeting point for creative talent. There's an opportunity to develop the evidence to be able to map that and to show the impact we're making through this embrace of creativity over time. I think that the global economy, as we stumble out of this crisis, is going to be looking for new stories in the creative economy, and Kuwait can be one of those news stories. And that's why I'm talking to you today. So I just will finish there, and we can open up to some questions, some discussions, some deliberation. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Tom, for tackling such a dense issue and subject matter that's really important for the future of Kuwait and for the future of the region. Before we delve into the questions, I'd like to recognize the attendance of His Excellency Dr. Khalid Mehdi, the Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Planning and Development. He's joined our panel and he's listening to your talk this evening. I'll dive into the first question. So the first question goes, how can we fast track the creative economy in Kuwait at a national level? As you stated, Tom, SMEs are the most creative and are doing so, but most of them want to reflect on a national level. As we know, the capability and the level we can make it reach, but unfortunately, the people in charge of reflecting the creativity are refusing this change or making it super difficult to do so. Hence the extreme slowness of our creative economy. How can we overcome this? So maybe just to reframe that question or that comment, is how can we make a business case in terms of a public policy from a government perspective?
I think that question probably is a very smart question, because it covers almost all of the ground that you need to cover if you are going to develop a strategic approach to the creative economy. I think this needs to be both top down and bottom up. On a bottom-up perspective, the creative industries needs to be more effective in self-organizing and in developing a shared voice, so that its micro attributes, because it is a small business sector, they can be designed out a little bit by developing a shared terms of reference. So I'd recommend that the sector comes together, both informally, but also perhaps formally. You could form a federation like they did in the UK. You could have develop a kind of membership which has a shared leadership role and a shared front door, so government can engage with the sector rather than just seeing a sea of micro enterprises. And the creative hubs and clusters and the networks have played a role to a point, but there's a level of there's a need now to go to the next level. From a top-down perspective, obviously that makes it easier for the government to engage because the sector is more visible and it's more coordinated. But the government also, I think, can move closer to the middle in terms of supporting the sector by providing some of those enabling conditions. So the government can co-invest in infrastructure around clusters and networks. It can make sure that there are targeted business support and investment programs for the sector. It can ensure that there are up-to-date access to skills programs as well. It can help in terms of the promotion of Kuwait as a creative hub, as to build the story now. And there's always a balance between the story running away beyond the reality. But I think that the best creative economies do have this kind of euphoric, optimistic, ambitious narrative that the government helps to drive overall. And the government, I think, can utilize that energy as a way of looking at the bigger picture in terms of infrastructure development that the sector needs. And that can include, for example, the development of a larger scale creative hubs, looking at creative district models, and obviously there's plenty to borrow there from Dubai, but to adapt and to develop on your own terms. I think that there's a lot that can be done in terms of heritage renovation and creating spaces for contemporary creative practice that the government can play a good role in. I think that the government can play a really strong role in terms of perhaps developing a kind of investment fund for creative development, and within that fund have an R&D element, so you become a hotbed for creative talent, but also to have next stage funding so that you keep the business, keep the value in Kuwait as the R&D starts to generate scalable businesses from that within the country. So ready yourself for next stage investment tailored towards the creative industries. because the creative industries often misses out from the kind of more generic or vanilla approaches to knowledge and tech investment. And so those are a few things that you can do. There's also regulatory aspects that need to be looked at, which I wouldn't want to bore you with now, but I think that it's broadly about coming together from the top and the bottom and finding some shared solutions.
Excellent. So next question, relating to your last point, what can the government do to facilitate the development of a creative economy? Is there a role for government in the equation, or is it mainly through private sectors? So I think to reframe that question or comment is, do we regulate, do we deregulate? What kind of support is needed to remodel the success story of the UK, for example?
Well, I would caveat that because the UK success story isn't always as rosy as perhaps the story is told. And I think that's why it's important to reflect on what we didn't do so well as what we did do so well. But there are some fundamentals that government did do, which I think are still being impactful today. One is it supported the development of the baseline of the creative industries. I know that government is playing an active role in that in Kuwait as well. You need to have your data. You need to have data-driven approaches to policy and investment. So the first thing they did back in 1998 and then subsequently more effectively in 2001 is that they developed a creative industries mapping program. And that required them to change the standard industrial and occupational classification of parts of the economy so you can actually measure and value the creative industries. That's one thing they did. The second thing they did was to formalize the organizational infrastructure of the sector. So setting up a film council or a film commission is one example I gave you. The UK also set up a design council as well. And so you can have a professional body which can have a tailored approach to skills, enterprise and promotion and networking within that sector, and also to investment and the attraction of inward investment. So looking at those kinds of intermediary development models is something that government can do as well. So it's not heavy government, it's still kind of arm's length, but it's still coming from the state fundamentally. And then government can also play a role in convening and being part of the sort of top level conversation with the private sector. So the UK, in the first iteration of its creative economy policy, set up a creative industries task force, and that involved key people in government, some representatives from some of the larger creative firms, and also from the higher education sector. And I think there was an international element to it as well. So it became an advisory board, then helped to co-design some policy solutions and to make the links between central government and the sector as well. It essentially kind of almost brought together a kind of manifesto or a platform for change for the sector. And then government can look at it in terms of a transversal or holistic approach. So there's a need to look at education policy and the opportunity of arts and creative practice within the curriculum. There's a need to look at enterprise and whether you need a tailored or bespoke approach to certain parts of the creative industries, there's always a kind of asymmetry often between business support programs and the creative industries because of the quite distinctive business models, or 20% of the average design business as a business model is different to other sectors, let's say. So the 80-20 challenge. So how do you bridge that gap as well? I could go on. I mean, so there's a range of different things. I think government has to play that balancing act. It has to be an enabler, but not the driver. And sometimes that requires going into the background, but actually obviously facilitating and enabling and investing. The key, you know, when the sector's of a level of maturity, when it has, where it's government that is more of an enabling partner rather than absolutely owning the whole process, because you know that the sector's got a level of maturity and critical mass, and that's when the private sector is able to flourish and to take the reins more. But I think you're some way off that at the moment in Kuwait because of the kind of scale and the profile of the sector.
Excellent. Next question. So Kuwait is heavily pursuing country demographics restructuring. How will this affect the creative economy, taking into consideration the size of Kuwait population? So to put this into context, I think it refers to upskilling local laborers and trying to introduce the concept of creative industries to the local population.
And this is something that I think has become even more of an urgency in a post-COVID environment because of the way COVID is accelerating technological change in so many ways, and obviously it's taking a lot of heat out of the economy, so people are losing their jobs bluntly. So there is a reskilling agenda in the economy as overall. But I think you need to start off from a demand side in many ways here. So the creative industries in Kuwait will only grow to its optimum scale if you start to validate and nurture demand for creative goods and services generated from Kuwait. And I think this is where there's a gap at the moment. So a kind of buy creative Kuwait type of agenda, because that in turn, when people see that, they recognize that they could have a role in that economy and they could fulfill, their dreams. And many people do have dreams, but they sort of put them to one side because they go to work in other sectors by necessity most of the time, but also potentially because they feel that they're inhibited by a culture that doesn't champion that sector. So build the market, nurture the market as much as possible, validate it, promote it as well, and make it resonate in people's lives. And then complementary to that, you start to develop entry points into that sector, working with universities, with business incubators, to start to provide pipelines of talent into that kind of infrastructure. And so those are two things. And then there's the upskilling question, which is really important. So I think part of that comes through cluster effects and collaboration and having strong networks. And you can convene activities where the knowledge exchange happens almost intuitively across the sector. But you also need to attend to specific skills gaps, and that's where self-organisation of the sector is key, and working with them in a professional way to get them to confess almost where they have specific skills gaps that need attending to if they're going to go to the next level. I'll give you a very quick example, which is in a very different context. We worked a lot in Nigeria, with the film sector there, where you have Nollywood, which is after Bollywood and Hollywood is the third most productive film sector in the world. But it's been built in an informal economy without accredited approaches to skills, very much on a kind of learn on the job basis, which has taken it so far. But now the next generation are wanting to build a genuine industry with that real scalability so they can compete on a global level and not just for minority interests outside of West Africa. And that's what they're trying to do now. But there's a culture clash where people resist an openness to accepting that they've got skills gaps. So I think that needs careful negotiation in any part of the creative industries. When you start to sell the prize that they can develop and grow enterprises as part of a big creative economy, people start to be more open about their development needs. And then you have a different problem because then you have a lot of demand for skills and business support all of the time from the sector.
Next question: how can a creative economy develop during an economic recession? Do you think this gives it a better business case to accelerate the whole issue of creative industries in the region?
Yeah, absolutely. You have to be optimistic, but I think von Trier said that it's something like the imagination works best in a context of friction, or I'm misphrasing him there, but there's something about friction and challenge that requires people to be innovative and to problem solve. And obviously we're in that very difficult situation at the moment. So this will push against people, and people will generate some incredible innovations as a consequence, both technological, but also in terms of content. The novels that are being written, the films that will be made when people are released from social distancing, the music that is going to be made. And no one wants to encourage recession and global crisis on anybody, but you can look at cultural renaissance periods in history, whether it's after a war or whether it's after or in the midst of economic crisis. There's a reset, and the imagination is fired in different ways. And I think this is going to happen. It is happening now, I'm sure, hidden away in people's houses and in different parts of the world. There is a cultural renaissance about to burst onto the scene. And from a consumption perspective, people are going to be hungry, so hungry for new content, whether that be face-to-face or digitally. There is going to be such a period of transformation. And this is why I think it's all the more important that in Kuwait and at a regional level that you're part of that new trajectory. And it would be such a shame to look back in 10 and 15 years' time and see that somebody else sees the moment.
Excellent, Tom. Thank you for answering all these questions. We're running out of time. I'll give the floor to His Excellency Dr. Khalid if he has any comments to wrap it up, or else we'll close the session. Your Excellency, Dr. Khalid.
Thank you very much, Faris. Dr. Tom, your speech and presentation is amazing. I have to admit, you covered and touched on all the nerves of a policymaker. You did an excellent description of what is going on around the world with some interesting and Kuwaiti taste, if you let me put it this way. Um, I'm, as a Kuwaiti, I'm very proud to be a citizen of a very creative society and very creative community. The creative economy in Kuwait is built in the history of the country. However, we are actually experiencing hiccups and accelerating the creative economy and looking at it from an industrial perspective, as a cashable business, as an economy that can actually contribute highly in the GDP. To me, it's a very much of a missed opportunity. However, we still have the institutional setup. The National Art and Culture Council has been around in the country before any other in the region. Meaning that we are very much into focusing on the art and the culture. However, due to many culture issues, many culture changes, many legislations as well, it created censorship in some cases. And as you know, censorship in a very conservative, I don't want to say very, because the Kuwaiti society is not as super conservative as you can see. It has its way of liberal, critical thinking, and more of a creative, as you can see it in our youth. Nuqat is a very good example, showing how youthful and creative our population is. However, we still have some other issues in the government that we in the Kuwait National Development Plan have some policy in order to restrict censorship, for example, into the media and the art of production. Within the guideline, within the general guideline, we do believe that we are trying in the government in the last years, there are a practice of over censorship on the, for example, the media and art of production. Kuwait, very well known for its art, media, and music production. We still, as Kuwait, being the icon for the artistic Kuwaiti's industry. We created a lot of brands. Our citizens are quite creative. We still lack the ecosystem that you talked about. I like your concept of a district, a creative district. Currently, we are struggling to come up with a proper legislation or a proper regulation for looking at the creative industry as an economic sector. Unfortunately, is until now, even within the government circle, they are looked at it as a culture and heritage sort of domain. I want to move from looking at it from heritage and culture domain into more of an economic sector. That's what you call it, the creative industry. That term, as much as it sounds very simple, it is a very complicated, especially when it comes to creating an enabling policy. I have to agree with you, government should stay away. It should be only enabling. We do not want to over-regulate. It's already over-regulated. We do not want to have more restriction into creative industry. I mean, at the end of the day, being a creative, you have no limit to think. The sky is the limit. That's the whole idea of, and you touched on education, my dear. I can't agree less. Creating a proper educational reform system that we introduce a critical thinking in our education system, in our K4 and K8 especially. We did some intervention for critical thinking through a program called Competencies Program, and unfortunately it was very highly resisted. Yes, we are emphasizing on the STEM. Now we are going for STEAM, adding art to the STEM curricula, but still it's quite challenging, and there is some what I call a culture clash. There is always a misunderstanding what a critical thinking means. How much you need to allow for that critical thinking. I am from a school that said there is no limit. The sky is the limit. Kuwait society is actually the reason for its survival in this very harsh environment is not just simply because we have oil. It is there are our grandfathers, they were very creative in coming up with a sustainable system that we survive all this year. So it's our duty now to proceed with more and more diversification. To me, I looked at the creative industries as an economic sector that require to increase its GDP percentage in the overall GDP of the country, and part of our diversification policy. I thank you very much, Dr. Tom, for sharing with us all these great ideas. It was a very amazing lecture, and as you can see, there were a lot of people actually attending, although it is, you know, it's Thursday time, which is equivalent to your Friday night. So
Indeed.
I thank you very much again, and over to you, Faris.
Thank you, Excellency Dr. Khalid, for your valuable comments with regards to the local economy and public policy making for the state of Kuwait. Dr. Tom, thank you so much for your presentation, for tackling such a dense subject in a concise manner and providing optimism at a time where it's difficult for Kuwait, the region, and the world with regards to COVID-19 and the pandemic. I think there's a lot of hopes and ambitions for the youth of Kuwait with regards to the creative industries, and we shall reach there hopefully in the near future. Thanks again for joining us tonight at the KPPC, and we look forward to hosting you in the near future. Tom, thank you again. And thank you to our guests and our audience. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you, my pleasure. Okay, good night. Bye.